Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the next section, which is 1.9 in Unit 1. And this section is going to be our next section about macromolecules, that being of lipids. Lipids are the only macromolecule without a universal monomer. Remember that each of the other macromolecules have universal monomers which make up the polymers. Lipids, however, don't have a universal monomer. However, some lipids do have a monomer called fatty acids. Now, the elements that make up lipids are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are the same elements that make up carbohydrates. However, they are not in the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio we see in those carbs. One key feature about lipids is that they're hydrophobic. Hydrophobic just means that they tend to repel or push against water. In most of these cases, it's because these lipids are non-polar. The bonds that form between these monomers are called ester bonds. And examples of lipids are like fats, oils, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. Like I said before, not all lipids are composed of fatty acids, but fatty acids are long hydrocarbon chains, which mean they have carbons and hydrogens. And then they end in something called a carboxyl group, which is a COOH group. Now, since these fatty acids are mainly comprised of carbons and hydrogens, they are going to be non-polar, which means this gives them a hydrophobic characteristic. You can see here are 3 different examples of fatty acids. Each of these fatty acids is comprised of a carboxyl group, that COOH group, and then long chains of carbons and hydrogens. I'm not going to go into the deep chemistry of what makes these carbons and hydrogens nonpolar, but these regions of the fatty acids are nonpolar, which means they're hydrophobic. Now, we have 2 different types of fatty acids. We have saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids don't contain double bonds. That means they're going to have a linear or straight physical appearance. While unsaturated fatty acids have at least 1 double bond, which means they're going to have bends in them. Now, you might notice that carboxyl group does have a double bond, but we're not talking about this double bond. We're talking about all the carbons and the hydrogens in the fatty acid tail. What we're specifically looking at are the hydrogen bonds here where we have a double bond. This makes this fatty acid unsaturated. You can see in this fatty acid there are no double bonds, which means it's saturated. When I remember saturated versus unsaturated, I think that the carbons are saturated with hydrogens, while the unsaturated one are missing the hydrogens here because of the double bond. Now, one of the most common examples of a lipid is something called a triglyceride. Triglycerides are a long-term energy storage molecule, and these triglycerides are made of a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. A typical glycerol molecule will be composed of 3 carbons and 3 OH groups. However, you can see that the hydrogens have been lost due to a dehydration synthesis reaction. That's because this glycerol and every carbon in the glycerol is going to be attached to one of 3 fatty acids. That's why it's called a triglyceride. This molecule is what your body uses for energy when you run out of carbohydrates. What your body does is it switches to breaking these triglycerides down into usable molecules like acetyl-CoA to fuel cellular respiration. Another type of lipid is called a phospholipid, and it's very similar to a triglyceride. A phospholipid is made of a glycerol, 2 fatty acids, and a phosphate group. You can see our 3 carbons within our glycerol molecule and our 2 fatty acids that we typically see in a triglyceride. However, that 3rd fatty acid is going to be replaced with a phosphate group. Now, if you remember our section about polarity, this phosphate group is made of 4 oxygen atoms, and that makes the phosphate very polar. So in turn, that makes the head of the phosphate group very polar, while the tails are very nonpolar. Now, these phospholipids make up the double membrane of cells. And these phospholipids, in turn, will help regulate what enters and leaves the cell based on the polarity of the phospholipid. That, again, being of the polar head and the nonpolar tails. Here's another way of looking at it. We have our cell that's made of a bilayer or a double layer of phospholipids, and those phospholipids are arranged with the heads on the outside and the tails on the inside. This is because the non-polar tails, or the hydrophobic tails, are going to be attracted to each other. The polar heads, or the hydrophilic heads, are also going to be attracted to each other, so they're going to arrange themselves in this fashion. Now, another example of a lipid is known as a wax, and this is when 2 fatty acids are going to be connected to an alcohol molecule. You can see in this wax our alcohol molecule here and the 2 fatty acids here. And this should kind of make sense because waxes repel water. They're hydrophobic. This is because they contain these fatty acids, which are non-polar. Another example of a lipid is known as a steroid. Now, this is where the monomer of a fatty acid is lost. As you can see, this is a typical steroid. These steroids don't contain fatty acids. However, they have 4 carbon rings bonded together. Now, since these steroids are made of these 4 carbon rings, they are most of the time going to have a non-polar characteristic, but not all of the time. The different functional groups within the steroids are going to determine what type of message or what type of function the steroid has. Our last type of lipid is known as a vitamin. These are just organic compounds essential for efficient metabolic processes that we find in most organic life. Typically, we have 2 different types of vitamins. We have water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins. But this is just a kind of subclass within lipids that I just briefly want to mention here. But the main ones are the phospholipids, the triglycerides, and the steroids. And to end this, like always, I absolutely love this meme. This might be my favorite meme of this unit. Because again, lipids are hydrophobic and they just repel water.